Chapter 6. For the Love of a Man. John Thornton had gotten frostbite in his feet the previous December, so his partners had made him comfortable and left him at the camp to get well, while they went up the river to get out a raft of saw logs for Dawson. He was still limping slightly at the time he rescued Buck, but in the warm weather even the slight limp left him. And here, lying by the riverbank through the long spring days, watching the running water, listening lazily to the songs of birds and the hum of nature, Buck slowly won back his strength. After traveling 3,000 miles, Buck allowed himself to be a bit lazy as his wounds healed, his muscles swelled out, and the flesh came back to cover his bones. In fact, everyone at the camp was taking it easy. Buck, John Thornton, and Thornton's two other dogs, Skeet and Nig, while they waited for the raft that would take them to Dawson. Skeet was a little Irish setter who quickly made friends with Buck, who, in a dying condition, was unable to stop her friendly advances. She was a nurturing dog, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, Skeet washed and cleansed Buck's wounds. Regularly, each morning after Buck had finished his breakfast, she performed this task, until he eventually came to appreciate and even look forward to her care. Nig, equally friendly, though he did not show it as much, was a huge black dog, half bloodhound and half deerhound, with eyes that laughed and an endless good nature. To Buck's surprise, these dogs showed no jealousy toward him. They seemed to share the kindliness of John Thornton. As Buck grew stronger, they enticed him into all sorts of ridiculous games, which even John Thornton himself would join. And in this fashion, Buck romped through his recovery and into a new existence. Love, genuine, passionate love, was his for the first time. He had never experienced this at Judge Miller's down in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. With the judge's sons, hunting and tramping, it had been a working partnership. With the judge's grandsons, a sort of guardianship, and with the judge himself, a dignified friendship. But love that was burning, that was adoration, that was madness, it had taken John Thornton to arouse. This man had saved his life, which would have been enough, but further, he was the ideal master. Other men saw to the welfare of their dogs from a sense of duty and business. John Thornton saw to the welfare of his as if they were his own children, because he could not help it. He never forgot a kindly greeting or a cheering word, and to sit down for a long talk with them was as much his delight as the dog's. He had a way of taking Buck's head roughly between his hands and resting his own head upon Buck's, of shaking him back and forth, the while calling him names that to Buck were love names. Buck knew no greater joy than that rough embrace and the sound of the man's voice, and at each jerk back and forth it seemed that his heart would be shaken out of his body, so great was his ecstasy. And when, released, he sprang to his feet, his mouth laughing, his eyes wide and knowing, his throat vibrant with unuttered sound, John Thornton would exclaim, "God, you can all but speak!" Buck had a love expression that he would return to the man. He would often seize Thornton's hand in his mouth and close so fiercely that he would leave impressions of his teeth on the man's flesh for some time afterward. And as Buck understood Thornton's actions to be out of love, the man understood Buck's friendly bite to be a sign of affection. For the most part, however, Buck's love was expressed in adoration. While he went wild with happiness when Thornton touched him or spoke to him, he did not seek out this attention. Unlike Skeet, who would often shove her nose under Thornton's hand and nudge until she was petted, or Nig, who would walk up and rest his great head on Thornton's knee, Buck was content to adore at a distance. He would lie by the hour, eager, alert at Thornton's feet, looking up into his face, dwelling upon it, studying it, watching each expression with intense interest. At other times, he would lie farther away, to the side or behind, watching the outlines of the man and the occasional movements of his body. And often, the strength of Buck's gaze would draw John Thornton's head around, and he would return the gaze, without speech, but with intense love shining out of their eyes at one another. For a long time after his rescue, Buck did not like Thornton to get out of his sight. From the moment he left the tent to when he entered it again, Buck would follow at his heels. His transient masters since he had come into the Northland made him fear that no master could be permanent. He was afraid that Thornton would pass out of his life as Perrault and Francois and the Scotch half-breed had passed out. Even in the night, in his dreams, he was haunted by this fear. At such times he would shake off sleep and creep through the night air to the flap of the tent, where he would stand and listen to the sound of his master's breathing. But in spite of this great love for John Thornton, which seemed to be an influence drawing him back to civilized life, the strain of the primitive beast, which the Northland had aroused in him, remained alive and active. Buck was faithful and devoted, yet he retained his wildness and cunning. He was a thing of the wild, come in from the wild to sit by John Thornton's fire, rather than a dog of the tame Southland, softened by the marks of generations of civilization. Because of his very great love, he could not steal from John Thornton, but from any other man in any other camp, he did not hesitate an instant, and the cunning with which he stole allowed him to escape detection. His face and body were scored by the teeth of many dogs, and he fought as fiercely as ever. Skeet and Nig were too good-natured for quarreling. Besides, they belonged to John Thornton. But any strange dog Buck encountered, no matter what the breed or how brave or strong it may be, swiftly acknowledged Buck's supremacy. And Buck was merciless. He had learned the law of club and fang well, and he never lost an advantage in a fight or held back from finishing off a foe. He had learned this lesson from Spitz, and from the chief fighting dogs of the police and mail teams, and knew there was no middle ground. He must master or be mastered, and showing mercy was seen as a weakness. Mercy did not exist in the primordial life. It was misunderstood for fear, and such misunderstandings could lead to death. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten was the law, and this mandate, down out of the depths of time, he obeyed. He was older than the days he had seen and the breaths he had drawn. He felt a deep connection to some eternal past that throbbed through him in a mighty rhythm to which he moved as the tides and seasons moved. He sat by John Thornton's fire, a broad-chested dog, white-fanged and long-furred, but behind him were the influences of all kinds of dogs, half-wolves and wild wolves, savoring the meat he ate, thirsting for the water he drank, scenting the wind with him, listening with him and telling him the sounds made by the wildlife in the forest, directing his moods and actions, lying down to sleep with him when he lay down, and dreaming with him and beyond him and becoming his dreams. These influences were so intense in him that each day mankind and the world of mankind slipped farther from him. Deep in the forest a call was sounding, and as often as he heard this call, mysteriously thrilling and luring, he felt compelled to turn his back upon the fire and to plunge into the forest, and on, he knew not where or why, and did not wonder where or why, the call commanding him from deep in the forest. But every time he left the camp and reached the soft, unbroken earth and green shade of the forest, the love for John Thornton drew him back to the fire again. Thornton alone had this effect on him. The rest of mankind was nothing. Occasional travelers might praise or pet him, but he did not care for them. When Thornton's partners, Hans and Pete, arrived on the long-expected raft, Buck refused to notice them until he learned they were close to Thornton. After that, he tolerated them in a passive sort of way, feeling as though he was doing them a favor by even acknowledging them. They were of the same large type as Thornton, down to earth, thinking simply and seeing clearly, and soon after they swung the raft into the big eddy by the sawmill at Dawson, they understood Buck and his ways, and did not expect the same affection from Buck that they received from Skeet and Nig. For Thornton, however, his love seemed to grow and grow. He, alone among men, could put a pack upon Buck's back in the summer traveling. Nothing was too difficult for Buck to do when Thornton commanded. One day the men and dogs were sitting on the crest of a cliff which fell away straight down to bare rocks 300 feet below. John Thornton was sitting near the edge, Buck at his shoulder. A thought came to Thornton, and he drew the attention of Hans and Pete to the experiment he had in mind. "Jump, Buck!" he commanded, sweeping his arm out over the chasm. The next instant he was grappling with Buck on the extreme edge while Hans and Pete were dragging them back into safety. "It's uncanny," Pete said, after it was all over and they had caught their speech. Thornton shook his head. "No, it is amazing, but it is terrible too. Do you know, his devotion sometimes makes me afraid. I'm not hankering to be the man that lays hands on you while he's around, Pete announced conclusively, nodding his head towards Buck. Pie jingo, was Hans's contribution. Not mineself either. It was at Circle City before the end of the year that Pete's apprehensions were realized. Black Burton, a man evil-tempered and malicious, had been picking a quarrel with a tenderfoot at the bar when Thornton stepped good-naturedly between. Buck, as was his custom, was lying in a corner, head on paws, watching his master's every action. Burton struck out with a punch, without warning, straight from the shoulder. Thornton was sent spinning and saved himself from falling only by clutching the rail of the bar. Those who were looking on heard what was neither bark nor yelp, but a something which is best described as a roar, and they saw Buck's body rise up in the air as he left the floor for Burton's throat. The man saved his own life by instinctively throwing out his arm, but he was hurled backwards to the floor with Buck on top of him. Buck loosed his teeth from the flesh of the arm and drove in again for the throat. This time the man succeeded only in partly blocking, and his throat was torn open. Then the crowd was upon Buck, and he was driven off. But even while a surgeon checked the bleeding of the man, Buck prowled up and down, growling furiously, attempting to rush in and being forced back by hostile clubs. A miners' meeting, called on the spot, decided that the dog had sufficient provocation and Buck was released. But his reputation was made, and from that day his name spread through every camp in Alaska. Later on, in the fall of the year, he saved John Thornton's life again. The three partners were navigating down a bad stretch of rapids on the 40-mile creek. Hans and Pete moved along the bank, going from tree to tree with a rope, while Thornton remained in the boat, steering with a pole and shouting directions to the shore. Buck, on the bank, worried and anxious, kept up with the boat, his eyes never off his master. At a particularly bad spot, where a ledge of rocks jutted out into the river, Hans ran down the bank with the end of the rope in his hand to guide the boat. But the raft was traveling too swiftly, and Hans pulled the rope too suddenly. The boat flipped, and Thornton was flung out of it and carried downstream toward the worst part of the rapids, a stretch of wild water which no swimmer could survive. Buck sprung into the water in an instant, and at the end of 300 yards, amid a mad swirl of water, he passed Thornton. When Buck felt Thornton grasp his tail, Buck headed for the bank, swimming with all his splendid strength. But the progress to the shore was slow, the progress downstream amazingly rapid. From behind, he could hear the fatal roaring where the wild water current was ripped in shreds and spray by the rocks which thrust through the surface like the teeth of an enormous comb. The noise of the water was frightful, and Thornton knew that reaching the shore was impossible. He scraped furiously over one rock, bruised across a second, and struck a third with crushing force. He clutched its slippery top with both hands, releasing Buck, and above the roar of the churning water shouted, "Go, Buck, go!" Buck could not hold his own and was swept downstream, struggling desperately but unable to win back. When he heard Thornton's command repeated, he partly reared out of the water, throwing his head high as though for a last look, then turned obediently toward the bank. He swam powerfully and was dragged ashore by Pete and Hans just before the point where he might have been lost for good. They knew that Thornton could only cling to a slippery rock in that harsh current for a few minutes, and they ran as fast as they could up the bank to a point far upstream from where Thornton was hanging on. They took the line they had been using to guide the boat and attached it to Buck's neck and shoulders, being careful that it would not strangle him or impede his swimming, and launched him into the water. He struck out boldly, but not straight enough into the stream. He discovered the mistake too late when he was being carried helplessly past John Thornton, just out of reach. Hans promptly pulled the rope as though Buck were a boat. The rope tightened on him in the sweep of the current, and he was jerked under the surface until his body struck against the bank and he was hauled out. He was half drowned, and Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, pounding the breath into him and the water out of him. He staggered to his feet and fell down. The faint sound of Thornton's voice came to him, and though they could not make out the words of it, they knew that he could not hold on much longer. His master's voice acted on Buck like an electric shock. He sprang to his feet and ran up the bank ahead of the men back to the place he previously jumped in. Again the rope was attached and he was launched, and again he struck out, but this time straight into the stream. He had miscalculated once, but he would not do it a second time. Hans let out the rope slowly, permitting no slack, while Pete kept it clear of coils. Buck held on till he was on a line straight above Thornton. Then he turned, and with the speed of an express train, headed down upon him. Thornton saw him coming, and as Buck struck him like a ram, with the whole force of the current behind him, Thornton reached up and closed both arms around the shaggy neck. Hans pulled the rope around a tree, and Buck and Thornton were jerked under the water. Strangling, suffocating, dragging over the jagged bottom, smashing against rocks and snags, they were pulled onto the bank. Thornton came to, and his first glance was for Buck, over whose limp and apparently lifeless body Nig was howling, while Skeet was licking the wet face and closed eyes. Thornton was himself bruised and battered, but he went carefully over Buck's body, finding 3 broken ribs. "That settles it," he announced. "We camp right here." And camp they did, till Buck's ribs healed and he was able to travel. That winter, at Dawson, Buck performed another exploit, not so heroic perhaps, but one that made his name even more famous in Alaska. This exploit was particularly gratifying to the 3 men, for they were in need of money and equipment to make a long-desired trip to find gold in the east, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the El Dorado saloon, where men were bragging about their favorite dogs. Buck, because of his fame, was the target for these men, and Thornton was stoutly defending him. At the end of half an hour, one man stated that his dog could start a sled with 500 pounds and walk off with it. A second bragged 600 for his dog, and a third 700. "Bah," said John Thornton. "Buck can start 1,000 pounds." "And break it out? And walk off with it for 100 yards? Demanded Matthewson, the man who claimed his dog could pull 700 pounds. "And break it out and walk off with it for 100 yards, John Thornton said coolly. "Well," Matthewson said, slowly and deliberately, so that all could hear, "I've got $1,000 that says he can't. And there it is." With that, he slammed a huge sack of gold dust down upon the bar. Nobody spoke. Thornton's bluff, if bluff it was, had been called. He could feel a flush of warm blood creeping up his face. His tongue had tricked him. He did not know whether Buck could start 1,000 pounds. 1/2 ton! The enormous reality of it struck him. He had great faith in Buck's strength and had often thought him capable of starting such a load, but never, as now, had he faced the possibility of it. The eyes of a dozen men fixed upon him, silent and waiting. Further, he had no $1,000, nor had Hans or Pete. "I've got a sled standing outside now, with 20 50-pound sacks of flour on it," Matthewson added. "So don't let that hinder you." Thornton did not reply. He did not know what to say. He glanced from face to face, not knowing what to think. The face of Jim O'Brien, a rich old friend of his, caught his eyes. Seeing him, John Thornton did something he would normally never have dreamed of doing. "Can you lend me 1,000? he asked, almost in a whisper. "Sure," answered O'Brien, thumping down a large sack by the side of Matthewson's. "Though it's little faith I'm having, John, that the beast can do the trick." The El Dorado emptied its occupants into the street to see the test. The tables were deserted, and the dealers and gamekeepers came forth to see the outcome of the wager and to lay odds. Several hundred men, furred and mittened, stood around the sled. Matthewson's sled, loaded with 1,000 pounds of flour, had been standing for a couple of hours, and in the intense cold, it was 60 below zero, the runners had frozen to the hard-packed snow. Men offered odds of 2 to 1 that Buck could not budge the sled. An argument arose concerning the phrase "break out." O'Brien said Thornton should be allowed to knock the runners loose, leaving Buck to break it out from a dead standstill. Matthewson insisted that the phrase meant breaking the runners from the frozen grip of the snow. A majority of the men who had witnessed the making of the bet decided in Matthewson's favor, that Buck should have to break the sled out from the ice, and the odds went up to 3 to 1 against Buck. There were no takers. Not a man believed Buck capable of the feat. Thornton had been hurried into the wager, heavy with doubt, and now that he looked at the sled itself, with the regular team of 10 dogs curled up in the snow before it, the more impossible the task appeared. Matthewson seemed jubilant. 3-1, Matthewson shouted. I'll lay you another 1,000 at that figure, Thornton. What do you say? Thornton's doubt was strong in his face, but his fighting spirit was aroused. The fighting spirit that soars above odds and fails to recognize the impossible. He called Hans and Pete to him. Their sacks were slim, and with his own, the 3 partners could only get $200 together. This was everything they had, yet they laid it without hesitation against Matthewson's $600. The team of 10 dogs was unhitched, and Buck, with his own harness, was put into the sled. He had noticed all the excitement, and he felt that in some way he must do a great thing for John Thornton. People murmured admiration at his splendid appearance. He was in perfect condition, without an ounce of superfluous flesh, and the 150 pounds that he weighed were so many pounds of grit and virility. His furry coat shined like silk. Down the neck and across the shoulders, his mane half bristled and seemed to lift with every movement, as though his vigor made each individual hair alive and active. The great chest and heavy forelegs were in proportion with the rest of the body, where the muscles showed in tight rolls underneath the skin. Men felt these muscles and proclaimed them hard as iron, and the odds went down to 2-1. Gad, sir, stuttered a member of the crowd. I offer you 800 for him, sir, before the test, sir. 800 just as he stands. Thornton shook his head and stepped to Buck's side. You must stand away from him, Matthewson protested. Give him plenty of room. The crowd fell silent. Only the voices of the gamblers could be heard, offering 2-1. Everybody acknowledged that Buck was a magnificent animal, but 20 50-pound sacks of flour seemed too large for them to place bets in Buck's favor. Thornton knelt down by Buck's side. He took Buck's head in his 2 hands and rested cheek on cheek. He did not playfully shake him like usual or call him soft love names, but he whispered in his ear, As you love me, Buck, as you love me. Buck whined with suppressed enthusiasm. The crowd was watching curiously. As Thornton got to his feet, Buck bit his mittened hand between his jaws, pressing in with his teeth and releasing slowly. It was the answer, in terms not of speech, but of love. Thornton stepped back. Now, Buck, he said. Buck tightened the traces, then slacked them for a matter of several inches. It was the way he had learned. Gee! Thornton's voice rang out, sharp in the tense silence. Buck swung to the right, ending the movement in a lunge that took up the slack and with a sudden jerk stopped his 150 pounds. The load quivered, and from under the runners arose a crisp crackling. Haw! Thornton commanded. Buck duplicated the move, this time to the left. The crackling turned into a snapping, the sled pivoting and the runners slipping and grating several inches to the side. The sled was broken out. Men were holding their breaths without realizing it. Now, mush! Thornton's command cracked out like a pistol shot. Buck threw himself forward, tightening the traces with a jarring lunge. His whole body was gathered compactly together in the tremendous effort, the muscles writhing and knotting like live things under the silky fur. His great chest was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad, the claws scarring the hard-packed snow in parallel grooves. The sled swayed and trembled, half started forward. One of his feet slipped, and one man groaned aloud. Then the sled lurched ahead in what appeared a rapid succession of jerks, though it never really came to a dead stop again. Half an inch, 2 inches. The jerks became a smooth motion as the sled gained momentum. Buck kept up until it was moving steadily along. Men gasped and began to breathe again, unaware that they had been holding their breath. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with short, cheery words. The distance had been measured off, and as he neared the pile of firewood which marked the end of the 100 yards, a cheer began to grow, and it burst into a roar as he passed the firewood and halted at command. Every man was wild with excitement, even Matthewson. Hats and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands, it did not matter with whom, and bubbling over in celebration. But Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head was against head, and he was shaking him back and forth. Those who were near heard him cursing Buck, and he cursed him long and fervently, and softly and lovingly. "Gad, sir! Gad, sir!" yelled a man. "I'll give you 1,000 for him, sir! 1,000, sir! 1,200, sir!" Thornton rose to his feet. His eyes were wet. The tears were streaming down his cheeks. "Sir," he said to the man. "No, sir. You can go to hell, sir. It's the best I can do for you, sir." Buck seized Thornton's hand in his teeth. Thornton shook him back and forth. As though animated by a common impulse, the onlookers drew back to a respectful distance. They dared not interrupt this moment between John Thornton and Buck.